Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in the Pan-European screening and panel discussion of the film Coded Bias. We're very happy that you're with us today. We have panelists actually joining us from across the globe. We're going to have the panelists introduce themselves and then also share with us what is on their mind quite regularly as it relates to AI and machine learning, what keeps them up at night on this topic. So let's start with Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Tatchell. I'm a human rights defender based in London, UK. The thing that concerns me is the way in which this new technology is so unregulated. It's exploding at a phenomenal pace. There's no transparency or accountability, and its potential misuse is very, very frightening.
Rasmus.
Sure, thanks for the invitation. So I'm Rasmus. I'm an AI researcher by training. Actually did my PhD on face recognition, so have very much seen there also all the problems around bias when training algorithms on face recognition, which was super interesting to see in the movie. I'm actually sitting 5 meters apart from Jewell on the AI campus in Berlin. And yeah, with Merantix, the company I founded, we're building AI first company. What's keeping me up at night is how can we, with this very powerful technology, how can we have a very positive impact on society and use AI in applications that actually help, and what are kind of the missing pieces? And I think like regulation is one of the big pieces there. And so yeah, also trying to actively participate there to see how we can get the right regulatory framework for AI to be in place.
And Daniel, you're sitting in Belgium, correct?
Yes, I'm here in Brussels. So thanks a million for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here on the panel with such amazing co-panelists. I'm here representing Access Now, and we're an international human rights organization that is dedicated to defending and extending the rights of users at risk around the world. And we fight for human rights in the digital age. So a large part of our work at the moment is on artificial intelligence. What keeps me up at night is worrying how certain trends in machine learning that are presented as technological developments are actually undermining social progress.
Okay, Sennay.
Thanks, Jewell. Thanks for having me in this panel. My name is Senna Gabriel. I'm Associate Professor of Social Intelligent AI at the University of Amsterdam and Scientific Director of Civic AI Lab. What keeps me up at night is the huge challenges that I see we are facing at the moment, namely the huge mistrust that exists among citizens towards AI and technology. Rightfully so to some extent, but there are also opportunities. And do we see these opportunities? How can we grasp those opportunities? Those are questions that keep me up at night. And in particular, how can we educate citizens to see those opportunities?
Thank you. Cathy, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you for having me. So I'm Cathy O'Neill. I'm a mathematician, data scientist, and algorithmic auditor. And yeah, what keeps me up at night is sort of all the invisible algorithmic harms that I feel like we're not even aware of, that are happening constantly and consistently, and they're accumulating. And yeah, I mean, they're adding to inequality. They're sort of destroying democracy, and they're abusing human rights and constitutional rights and legal rights and stuff. So for me, it's like, how do we become more aware of the harms?
We'll have you go deeper into that in the near future, for sure. Alexandra, how are you today? Thank you for joining us.
How I could have been not well with an amazing co-panelist group like that. So thanks a lot for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm based in Vienna. I'm Chief Trust Officer at an AI startup that focuses on synthetic data. So our vision is to enable a data ecosystem where privacy is actually respected, but we also do a lot in the space of ethical AI and fairness. And you asked what keeps me up at night, and it's basically a summary of what we've just heard. So on the one hand, I'm a believer that we have huge potentials with AI, but I think there's really a general unawareness both on the regulatory side as well in the general public, what the risks are and what should be addressed now. And I hope that discussions like this and the movie can contribute to creating this awareness that is so desperately needed.
Thank you guys for sharing that. I also want to introduce my colleague here, Yudan Lin of Unexpected Data. Yudan, how are you doing today?
So I'm very good, thank you. For our current panel, I would like to understand how can we give more awareness to those people that may not be aware that they have bias, and also how can we embed empathy in this digital world?
Well, I think that's a very good question. So how can we create more awareness for these topics of bias in artificial intelligence? Of course, also making organizations aware of this. I think when we come to organizations here, I think it's important that we really have some regulations in place that actually force them to think about these things. Luckily, there are a few organizations that want to develop AI based on ethical guidelines that have been developed in the past. But I think to really make sure that this is addressed on a broad level, there is no way around regulations. So I'm actually looking forward to seeing that. And of course, addressing the general public. Movies definitely help, panel discussions definitely help, but also thinking about ways how we can actually translate this topic in a more digestible manner for the general public. And I don't say that I have the answer for that.
Thank you. I would like also to have your point of view, Peter, because you were one of the pioneers when it comes to the gay pride. So you were here the first one who initiated such a movement. So how could you see that we could provide more awareness about AI and also raise even further this empathy part?
Well, as many of you know, there are draft proposals before the European Union at the moment to regulate facial recognition technology primarily. I haven't been able to ascertain the full details of that, and it's not going to be a complete ban. It is going to be some form of restriction, some form of control. But what is interesting is that while there is an entirely understandable and legitimate focus on facial recognition technology, none of these voices of dissent within the European Union who have pushed for these proposals seem to be raising any issues about the potential of AI to use technology to identify people's sexuality, gender identity, race, disability, or a host of other personal attributes, which may be useful perhaps in some extreme circumstances, but are potentially open to huge abuse. So for me as a human rights defender, I'm primarily concerned and knowledgeable about the human rights dimension, the openness for abuse that this technology does provide. Having said that, I do want to emphasize that obviously there are potential benefits as well, and I don't close my mind to the benefits that could accrue. And I noted that recently there was a report in Britain that AI technology was more successful in diagnosing illnesses in patients than doctors. So it has a potentially positive role to play, but it has to be with democratic control and accountability and with safeguards and protections for individuals.
Daniel, what are your thoughts on that? I know you have something to say considering what you've been doing over at Access Now.
Yeah, so I have had time to go through the full proposal, so I'm happy to talk about it, but I can actually put your mind at ease, Peter, because we have actually been campaigning precisely for a ban on automated recognition of gender identity and sexual orientation. And we have actually mobilized members of the European Parliament to send letters about it. So there was, for example, when the proposal was leaked a couple of weeks ago, I think about 40 members of Parliament led by Alexandra Green MEP, sent a letter specifically pointing to the need to actually prohibit exactly the practices you were talking about. So thankfully we have a good movement going to deal with that. In terms of the question that you asked, Yudan, I personally happened to read a book a few years ago that completely opened my mind to the problems of AI by someone called Cathy O'Neill, which I can highly recommend to anyone. So I'm actually a bit starstruck to be on a panel with Cathy, but I can highly recommend that to anyone. And also the film that we've just watched, I think, you know, really centers the voices that need to be heard, the people who are really doing the key work to expose the issues here. So I think it's fantastic that we have this, and you know that it's been taken up on a big platform like Netflix. In terms of the question on embedding empathy, I'm not exactly sure how to take that. Was it a question about like emotion recognition and like you know, affective computing? Was that? Yeah. If it is, then I'm quite wary about embedding that actually. Maybe it's something we can come back to. The idea that, you know, we can teach machine learning models to identify emotion, and, you know, it's something that actually we have campaigned against as well, because there are good reasons to be very wary of, you know, training systems to identify our emotions or to try to play around with that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it was a good movie in a sense that it like really highlighted the problems of face recognition technology, and also how I think unaware society in general, like many people were, like what the face recognition technology could really do and where it's implemented, and that people obviously are not fine with the way it is. And I just hope that, you know, this movie kicks off kind of more conversation between the people who develop the technology and also the regulator and also society, because I think that's one of the biggest problems. Like, you know, like I can be easily very much be in a bubble of people who build algorithms, and which is would be then very detached from maybe the actual users or the people, the regulators, or the people who worry about data privacy and biases. And I think, you know, each of these communities tend to be very much in their silos, and so I think we need to have much more of these forums also now, like these discussions where all these people come together and have a very open discussion around the problems and also how to mitigate it. Because even for us, from a like very commercial point of view of building products we want to sell, is for us it's important that also society accepts the product. And if we know very early onwards that, for example, this face recognition product won't fly for regulatory purpose, but also not because society doesn't want it that way, then that's also good to know for us. So I think you want to bring all these stakeholders much closer together and have basically everybody already talk to each other even before a product is being started to be developed. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we started the AI campus here in Berlin, where we will also not just have people building algorithms, but also people who deal with regulations, and also some organizations that represent society more broadly, and have them kind of involved in this process very early onwards.
Cathy, I have a question for you specifically, actually. You know, you've been involved, like I really enjoyed the film where you're talking about, obviously, that you had been in the industry before, specifically the financial industry. Do you think people regularly are getting together talking about the products and services that they're building, and then realizing if they support X, Y, and Z, or is that just not a conversation that's being had?
I mean, I was also a data scientist working in ad tech after being in finance. You know, one of the things that I found interesting about the fallout of the financial crisis was that the people who worked inside the Moody's, Fitch, and S&P had emailed each other. They were the ones responsible for the AAA ratings on the mortgage-backed securities that became toxic. They emailed each other with like admissions that like they would give AAA ratings to like cow shit, I think, like was one of the emails. Like, so yeah, they knew that they had sold out as risk modelers. And they knew they were doing it for the money. That was kind of the thing. Now, when I went into ad tech to flee finance and I joined Occupy Wall Street, you know, I thought I was getting away from that. But then when I saw quite directly that our new job was to profile people and segregate their internet experience by gender, class, and race, and give certain people who like deserved the good things opportunities and other people to deny those opportunities, I brought it up with people I worked with, and they're like, we're here for the money, Cathy. Like, so it was very similar, actually, strangely. It was very clear to them why they were doing what they were doing. And like they were building a machine that would benefit them, not only because they're getting paid to do it, but that they weren't worried about the consequences, because after all, they were like not going to be. I mean, in fact, the VC who came to my company to talk about the future of tailored advertising specifically said he was looking forward to the time when all he saw on the internet was advertisements for trips to Aruba and jet skis, and never again had to see another University of Phoenix ad, because those weren't for people like him. You know, I didn't really know about University of Phoenix, so I looked into it and was like, oh yeah, for-profit college doesn't really educate their students and only advertises to the intersection of the two groups, people poor enough to qualify for financial aid, so the money goes straight from the government to them and saddles the person with debt, and the people who are naive enough about college to think that for-profit is good, like it's a private college. So it's like mostly, I mean, they specifically looked for, you know, children of immigrants, often single Black women, mothers, with the pitch that like, don't you want your child to have a middle class life? Don't you want your child to have a better life than you have? It was like unbelievable. But the technology that I was contributing to at the moment was going to make it easier to do this. It's easier to find those people, easier to pitch it to those people. And it was simply predatory. So like that was the VC saying like, this is my goal. My goal is to have the internet structured this way. That is in fact, I appreciated him saying that. I'll say that because it was just so unavoidable that this was for a future where we didn't have to like be even exposed to the existence of the predatory stuff, because after all, we have money and education and we deserve better. It was really, really values laden and greedy. And yeah. By the way, if you don't mind, I'm going to just make one comment on what I've heard other people say so far, which is that like, I don't think we should be talking about new regulation yet. Why do I say that? Because we have not figured out how to enforce our existing regulation. You know, like I work as an algorithmic auditor, and I can tell you, like, we don't know what it means for a hiring algorithm to be compliant with existing law. We don't know what it means for a credit algorithm to be compliant with existing law, or an insurance algorithm. There's plenty of regulated industries that are using algorithms today where the regulators have no idea how to enforce their own laws. And I do think we're going to have to figure that out. And I say first because we'll learn a lot. We'll learn a lot in the process of figuring out what exactly that means. And then we will write better laws. I mean, I know I'm talking to some Europeans here, and Europeans love laws. And by the way, I'm totally pro-regulation. I definitely want the burden of algorithmic harms to be on the people using the algorithms rather than the victims of those harms, which it currently is. But I'm just saying, like, never mind regulations. We got regulations. We need enforcement. That's step zero.
So I really like what you said, Cathy, where we should reinforce the regulation which is already in place. But I would like to ask where to start then, because on one hand, we would like to be in Europe, for example, one of the leader in AI, going in front of China, going in front of the US. And at the same time, we would like to bring up this framework where we are willing to, make a little compromise on consent and privacy, but still trying to, be the land of humanity, in quotes, I would say. So for this, I would like really to hear what Sennay has to say, because he's the director of Civic AI Lab.
Well, I kind of extend on what Cathy just said for a number of reasons. Of course, there's regulation already, which needs to be enforced, but is it enough? And is it in the context of the new EU regulations? One of the questions, for example, that came up was that banning face recognition, does that also mean that you ban face recognition for refugees? Which is not clear, right? It could be that by regulating or by focusing on regulation, you shift away the burden or the harm from perhaps Europe and shift it to other regions of the world. So in that sense, regulation, apart from not being enforced at the moment, might not also be the right way to go or the only way to go. Top-down regulation of AI helps to make AI more human-centered. But I think if we focus on the long run, if we focus on the future, democratizing AI is much more important than regulating AI. By that, I mean, we should make AI part of us all. We should all contribute as citizens to AI in the process of designing it, developing it, assessing it, using it. This happens too little. In my point of view, you can top-down regulate, but let's bottom-up democratize AI. That empowers citizens and people from the bottom-up rather than from top-down.
But how do we go about that? I mean, how do we start that process? What's your recommendation for that?
Well, I think there's much focus on quick solutions. There's much focus on, for example, now also on awareness when it comes to AI and the possibilities, the possible harms that it can do. I think we should focus in parallel. It's good to create awareness. I think it's good to, in parallel, focus on taking ownership by educating people, by educating the next generation, by making AI education part of the core curriculum for all students at all ages. That will take time, but in the long run, it will help us democratize AI. If we focus now on controlling it, on regulating, on the quick solutions, we will not be able to solve issues that are emerging at other parts of the world, or not in face recognition technology, but perhaps in neurotechnology, where there are also many biases popping up and emerging, right? Are we going to fight all these harms one by one? Or are we going to focus on a more fundamental level and educate the next generation to be more aware, more skilled, more socially involved and engaged?
Daniel, you would like to react to that?
I just jump in as the defender of the regulation. One thing I can, ease your worries, Cathy, because the EU legislative process is very slow. So by the time that it comes in, I think it'll be exactly right on time. But no, seriously, I think one thing that it does, we've been critical of the current proposal. We've said it doesn't go far enough in terms of prohibitions on certain applications and in terms of the transparency obligations it puts down. But to speak positively about it, I think one thing that it does is that it sets a ground floor for transparency, which I think is really important. And, for an algorithmic auditor, I think it incentivizes this process. Anyone who falls under the list of high-risk systems is going to have to go through conformity assessments, and also a lot of the information about the use of any of these high-risk systems will be available to civil society, to the general public, in an EU-wide database of high-risk systems. So if you look at the situation we have as civil society at the moment, we don't know when systems are being used. We tend to have to do freedom of information requests. We find out when someone's already harmed by a system, and then we need to try to track down information about it. With this new model, it would switch the burden there, and we would know in advance what systems are being put on the market. We want that to go further. We want to know about where they're being used. But I think, you know, the regulation is quite forward thinking in that, you know, it's just making what already responsible developers do the bottom line that everyone has to do, which I think is really important. And I wasn't sure I fully got Sennay's point about refugees, because I mean, just one thing to point out is that one of the clear red lines we've been pushing for is to really look at how AI systems are being used at borders, because we've seen horrible things actually funded by EU public money under Horizon 2020, their funding model. They funded, for example, a system called iBorder Control, which was an AI lie detector. Now, lie detection polygraphs do not have good scientific basis. And if you just throw machine learning onto that, it doesn't make it any better. And they were actually testing this on refugees, on asylum seekers, on immigrants, and were even denying access from freedom of information requests from members of the European Parliament to find out about the ethics assessment that project went through. So we're really focused on how this could impact refugees, asylum seekers, and yeah.
Alexandra, I think you had something that you wanted to add.
Yes, I actually wanted to add something to what Senna just said. So I absolutely agree that it's super important that we democratize artificial intelligence, that more and more people get really educated about how to create it, but also how to use it, what the pitfalls and what the pros of it are. But I think doing just that, especially since Senna emphasized that this is a long-term solution, we would be too late. So I think we really need both. We need this long-term approach, and we need to start thinking about how to get there now. But I think we also need the regulation as fast as the European Union can come up with it, and we just heard it will take quite some time, because currently we're in a situation where AI, actually the majority of the AI is developed by the big tech companies in the United States and in China. And one thing that concerns me is that the more people that enter in the domain of AI, they start out at a level where they usually use some components of these big cloud marketplaces and cloud platforms. And if those are already biased, then we're going to perpetuate bias and build so much more bias in the new data that's generated that we just, the longer we let the situation go on, make it harder to get the bias out. So I think we should really, with the knowledge we have now, make the first recommendations, soon regulations, and then learn from that and continuously improve to not let bias perpetuate itself for quite some time.
Yeah, actually adding on what has been said, I think also as Cathy said, I mean, there is a lot of existing regulations, like for all of our AI products, we're operating in spaces like in healthcare where there is existing regulation that can also be applied to AI. And I think what we've been struggling with is the company kind of, like making sure that we really understand how this regulation is now applied for the AI use case. And there's usually a lot of uncertainty. So we on our side try to figure out, okay, how do we make sure it's robust? How do we make sure there's no bias? How do we make sure it's fine from a data privacy perspective? And I wish there would be kind of, instead of like now adding a lot of new regulation, people would rather work also on the existing regulations we have out there and trying to make them more clear and like further developing them towards AI and many industries. Because I'm also not against, or I'm also not in favor for less regulation. I'm very much in favor for clear regulation. I think that has been and not the case in many areas, and I think that is very bad, and obviously also leads to a lot of misuse. And I think the other part that Sennay said, very much agree. I think democratizing it, making it clear to everybody how to use it, what bias is, what data privacy is, like we should do that as early as possible, like maybe even in primary school already. I think that would be very important. And maybe one last thought to add. I think, we're talking a lot about biases and algorithms having problems. Maybe to give this a different spin, or maybe a slightly provocative spin, I think like a lot of biases have been there for like decades, even before AI, right? Like if you think about credit scoring. Like if you walk into a bank, that person might have already made a decision whether they give you a loan before you even have said a single word. So there's like a lot of very bad biases in the real world. And I think we could have now the chance with AI that these biases become more transparent as we see with these algorithms. And if we now find the right regulation and make sure the algorithms are ideally not biased, that would be actually a good way to fight such biases. But just saying, like, it's been a problem before, and I think if you go there to the bank and the person makes the credit decision, there's a bias in the head, and it's like that's a black box. Like we obviously don't have access to that. So now with algorithms, we would have access to that, and so we could actually work against it. And so yeah, I would be very much in favor to see how we can make this happen.
Go ahead, Cathy. You can just jump in, Cathy.
Oh, okay.
No need to raise the hands.
Okay. All right. Well, I wanted to provocatively push back against the idea of algorithmic literacy. I don't think this is a call for AI literacy. I mean, I'm not against education. I like education. But my experience with literacy drives, like financial literacy, is a way of telling poor people you should be making more money. Here's how to save for your kid's college. Dude, if I had money to save for my kid's college, you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't need your help. I know how to put money into a bank. Similarly, I feel like literacy drives are basically trying to say, this is your individual responsibility rather than our responsibility. So like going back to the example of like refugee facial recognition, like no literacy drive is going to help them. It's about power, not about knowledge. Or another way of saying that is, I want there to be literacy, but I want there to be literacy on people's rights, not on how the technology works. Like nobody should have to know how the technology works. That's the whole point of putting the burden of harms onto the purveyors of the technology rather than the targets of the technology. So I'm just like not into the literacy thing. I don't think it'll solve a problem except get more technologists to drink the Kool-Aid because now they're making money off of it too. I want this to be a question of like, how do we make sure that what we're doing isn't fucking other people? And to Rasmus's point, I would like to say that like, it's really important that we come up with the right regulation, and we need some models of that. And honestly, like I'm working furiously as an algorithmic auditor to work with regulators to say, here's how we can have these conversations with inside industry people and experts and activists and other people who represent stakeholders who get impacted by this technology and lawyers who came up with the policies in the first place to say, what does it mean for this to be not racist as a hiring algorithm, or not sexist as a admissions to college algorithm, or whatever it is? Like, it's really, really difficult for people who build the algorithms to know how to follow a constraint that hasn't been well defined. So we do need to do that well, and we need to come up with those constraints in some kind of reasonable way, because right now it's just going to be either there's going to be no constraint, which is what's happening now, or it's going to be a constraint sort of defined by the lobbyists, or worse, it's going to be like a random thing that means nothing and has potential for gameability that's just written down by some policymaker who doesn't really understand enough. So I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of room for learning right now. And that's why I'm pushing against like new regulation. I'm just like, guys, we don't even know how to enforce the simplest questions of existing law. The last thing I'll say is that like facial recognition is required in the United States at a federal level. It would take an act of Congress to change the fact that every Department of Motor Vehicles, every state that issues driver's licenses uses facial recognition and shares their database with the FBI and ICE. And this is because of what's called the Real ID Act that happened after the 9/11. So like one of the things that I just want to make sure people know is like we might have like local bans on facial recognition, but we do not have anything like a federal ban. Not to mention facial recognition at the borders, like border control. They're all about facial recognition. It would be a huge political fight to ban facial recognition at that level. International border controls, like, forget about it. So, I mean, I just like being realistic here. What we should do is talk about what it means to have, like, you know, facial recognition that has accountability. That's my personal take on it.
So from that, I would like to ask a question, especially to our human rights and civil liberties experts here in the panelists. Those rights are here already since centuries and centuries. Why and how can we enforce that in the digital world? Who should be accountable then for all what is happening in the AI world? How can we make that happen?
If I could perhaps throw a couple of points. I mean, human rights law was devised in the pre-digital age. So there was no concept of the kinds of challenges that we're now facing. So that would make a very strong case for a digital or AI human rights charter. For someone, perhaps someone already has, but I'm not aware of it, to draw up a charter of human rights around AI issues. That would seem to me a very important update to the existing body of human rights law. And of course, it's been done before, you know. Human rights law, you know, the main centerpiece was the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But there have been, since then, more than a dozen major updates and expansions, such as the Genocide Convention, Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions Against War Crimes, the Rights of the Child, and so on. So having a new human rights charter addressing AI issues strikes me as a really paramount, fundamental next step.
But isn't it AI or human racist the same? They are both racist and then should not be there? Or sexist or whatever unethical part of it?
Just explain that again, sorry.
So if an algorithm is racist and a human is racist, and at the end the output of it is really harmful to one human being, isn't it the same at the from the law perspective, from the framework perspective? Shouldn't it be at the same level and just covered under the same law or regulation?
Well, I think, you know, regulation or human rights in this field would have to look at outcomes. You know, what is the outcome of this particular algorithm or this particular AI? So you can set up certain principles about right to privacy, non-surveillance by corporations or the state, regulations requiring no bias, but then the ultimate test would be in looking at the consequences or effects of those algorithms. And if they showed a bias, then that would mean that the algorithm or the AI was clearly in contravention of that human rights principle. But there are more expert people in AI than me who could probably work out the details of that.
Daniel, do you think that we should have a committee very diverse and inclusive with who are here to test all the new possible algorithm that is coming out, and then have this test result to see if it is ethically valid to be released to the large public?
I mean, just to come back a bit to your first question, so we're a digital rights organization. So our entire mission is to defend human rights in the digital age. And to date, we have actually found the existing human rights legislation not only sufficient, but incredibly useful for dealing with digital issues. I think, you know, if you look at the current proposal from the EU on the AI regulation, or the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, you know, these are based on, you know, established human rights principles, and they do an incredible amount of work to protect us. I also say that Access Now, along with Amnesty International, in 2018 already published the Toronto Declaration, on defending the right to equality and non-discrimination in the context of machine learning systems. So, there is ongoing work and I think there is adaptation. There are certain challenges presented by some of these machine learning systems, for example, that, need to be thought through in the context of fundamental rights. But maybe just to point to one other initiative is the Council of Europe is currently preparing the groundwork for a potential legal instrument on artificial intelligence. And again, the debate is going on there. I represent Access Now on the working group that they have. And, there is this debate about, are existing rights sufficient to protect us in the context of AI? And I think it's something we've seen again and again, is that a human rights lens actually really cuts to the heart of the problems, because sometimes with the ethical principles that you see companies putting out, they often tend to come from a utilitarian perspective. This system could, produce so much benefits, create so much wealth, so much value, or benefit the lives of so many people. So if it harms some people, that's something we can write off. It's a net benefit analysis. But human rights comes at things from a different perspective. You're coming at it a deontological rather than a utilitarian perspective, and you're looking at what harms are impermissible. And it doesn't matter if, bringing in a system is going to benefit certain people, even like 99% of people. If it undermines the rights of 1% of people, then that is going to be impermissible. We don't balance human rights against innovation or against economic value. So I think it's for us, it's provided an incredibly valuable lens to analyze the harms of AI.
I think one of my issues is that we talk about legislation and sitting at the table and coming up with new rules. But the problem is, I think the core of where all these things are coming from, that itself is not diverse. There's not citizens that are sitting there that are invited, kind of like if you have jury duty or whatever. I think when things like this are being said, this is how we can get citizens and help kind of democratize this system. Because again, we're sitting here where there's people that maybe haven't been on the other side, where it's been something that's worked against them, that are also saying, oh, let's get together and come up with something new. So that's just, I think that we need a better system of making sure that we're inclusive at the core of making and coming up with these situations. And even if it's jury duty, someone gets something in the mail and they're like, hey, we're getting together on August 20th. We like to invite you to come and sit in, but I think we have to change something from the beginning as we're sitting here talking about, this stuff.
Yeah, Jewell, I'll just say that I, in my algorithmic auditing company, just two things that were just mentioned. First, we invite people who represent the stakeholders to the conversation. So it's not a jury duty because they don't have to come, but they do. They're interested because we choose algorithms that are high stakes for people like them, right? And the other thing is that we build what we call the ethical matrix, where we have stakeholders are rows and their concerns, negative or positive, are columns. And some of them are like, we are concerned that this legal right of mine is going to be in jeopardy. And to the previous point that you don't balance, human rights abuses versus innovation. That's really what we're doing. When we're doing that, we're saying, oh, look, this is not actually something that you have an option to ignore. You can't do this. This is a hard constraint. So you have to pay attention to this, even though it is interfering with this column up on the top left, which is your financial interest. So that's the whole point of that procedure. The ethical matrix framework is to surface these as values, as conversations of balancing the rights and the concerns and the harms of the different stakeholder groups. And by the way, completely non-technical conversation, doesn't require any knowledge of the underlying algorithms or technology. It's what do you think? How do you think you might get benefit or be harmed by this system? That's the technical level of it. And the point is to have that conversation and do the balancing and be aware of the issues and the risks. And then once that's fixed, the technology people, the experts, translate those choices into code. They are translators. They are not ethicists. They have, they're not in charge of making the ethical choices. they're in charge of translating the ethical choices faithfully into code.
I would like to come back to what Alexandra said about, you know, those people who really come into the AI market, who are already using the technology that was already shaped from those giant tech. And we are kind of going to this circle where we don't know any other alternative. And for sure, you, Cathy, you showed us another way to go. So I would like to go further this way and ask you, what are your alternative or your thoughts about possible alternative here? Because how we talked about it is really, we think that we can fix it already, but what happens if the technology there's no possibility to fix it? If there's no legal safeguard that are sufficient, what happens then?
Yeah, so I would actually also love to see it move forward in the direction that Cathy just explained, where not a few algorithms that are high stakes, but actually all of the algorithms that are high stakes are audited and also developed in a way where you get in all of these different concerns and aspects from people. And this is also why I think that literacy is still important, because currently algorithms are predominantly developed by white male people from either Western or Chinese culture. And I think AI, with the predictions that we have on its impact on the world, will be deployed in so many areas of the world where we have so many different cultures. And I think that's currently not well enough reflected. So I think that's a very important step. And therefore, I think having more certifications also, or guidelines on how actually to go about to develop an AI system, that it's not the data scientists, the AI engineers that should be the ones in charge to decide what the system is about, is a very important step. And then one other thing that I think also needs to be addressed is, are the people that developing these algorithms actually equipped with the knowledge to perfectly translate these ethical decisions that were made beforehand? Because getting bias out of AI is such a challenging system. Detecting even bias in AI is so difficult. And I think there are also more research is needed to have stronger recommendations on how to actually go about this endeavor.
Sennay, I saw you agreeing with Alexandra was saying. Would you like to add something?
No, I just to reemphasize that literacy is important. I mean, the datafication and optimization of society is happening. It's a fact. Society is changing. So you have to be able, you don't need to know the technology inside out, but you have to know the basics. It helps to know where you stand, where your rights are, how far you are from your rights. That needs at least the basic literacy on algorithmic thinking and so forth. So in that, I really think it's important to and when it comes to the big tech and there's a common impression now that the big tech are too big to fall, and citizens can't do anything about it. They have just to join them, which is of course not. It's an impression that serves big tech. It's not. It's not reality. I think the biggest threat to big tech are the 3 million people, kids, that are creative or that can be creative, that have skills, imagination. If you give them the space and the tools and the education to come up with something, then that will help democratize AI. Thinking from big tech perspective, thinking from regulation, I really find that often taking away oxygen from what can be done, what can be the future, right? I know it's important and it needs to be done, so I really understand that and appreciate that. But it's also good to think ahead. What can be done? Think out of the box. And for that, imagination is important, education is important, skills is important.
Yeah, I mean, if I get Cathy, I don't think she was saying like education shouldn't happen. I just think she was saying it should happen in a different way without someone who's in charge saying this is kind of how it needs to be done. You know, there's this one saying like, you know, if you knock on a door, people don't let you in, just build another door. I think we're kind of at the stage where another door needs to be built, because even in the film, it was brought up how like the guys that created it, what year was that? Somebody knows the year. It was built like, you know, by these guys, you know, that look like obviously all the startup people that I work with too, and venture folks. But at the end of the day, I just think it's about, you know, if I reflect on the film too, like we're bringing up these situations and these challenges. And the thing is, can we fix something that is so broken, or do we just need to start from scratch and then have something going on here? We have this existing here, and we find a way to kind of co-create together. Because to be honest, I don't think we can undo what's already been done, but I do think that we can start something that needs to be done and that's more inclusive and can help our citizens and society. That's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think so. That in general, I think in 4 key dimensions of change. I would say sustainable change in thinking about AI and working on AI. One dimension is what's the purpose? What's the intention? What's the plan? Purpose and plan, right? Why do you develop AI? With what intentions? Is it just to optimize speed and cost, or is it to empower people? Another dimension is people and perspectives. It's good to build AI in teams of people from different backgrounds, professionally, personally, and so forth, just to have this different perspectives on things. The other one is past and present. A lot of AI, a lot of algorithms are trained on historical data. We should be able to use data that is from now and local, right, to represent the people better, communities better. And the fourth is procedures and processes. There needs to be more transparency. There needs to be more accountability. There needs to be more cooperation in the way AI is developed. And most importantly, there needs to be co-creation with citizens. I think citizens, in a way, are the self-cleansing power of self-learning systems. So you need to bring them in the process right from the onset on.
Well, this is a good opportunity, I think, to bring up this question, like what rule of thumb should creators and innovators use as they're building new products and services to make sure that their quote unquote solution does not have built-in bias?
I would say the first answer to that is really be sure where your data is coming from, because bias rarely enters at the model stage. It's more the data, as we just heard, historic data that has biases to it, insufficiently collected training data, like we saw in the movie, where maybe the images of white males were represented and not enough images from females. So I think really starting at the data and also questioning where it's coming from, how it was collected. Also, we saw this with the Compass data set. That the way police went about its business in the United States led to a data set that led to the consequence of Compass. So I think starting at the data is definitely a good point.
I'm going to just be provocative again and suggest that it's not just about the data, like that sometimes bias comes from data. It often comes from missingness of data as well. It also comes from the way it's deployed differently on different populations, which is not about the data at all. It often comes from the wrong choice of target or objective function, which is not about data either. Look at Facebook's newsfeed algorithm. It's designed to optimize their profit, i.e. to keep us on Facebook. That's not about the data per se, it's about their choice of success. And I would also say there's no one list of things that we should be worried about. And it's not just bias. And it won't be solved just by transparency. There's no panacea. There's no like one silver bullet that's going to solve this. There's no one problem that causes this. But to answer your question, Jewell, the question we should always be asking as designers and deployers of algorithms is, for whom does this fail? And when is that failure unacceptable? That we have to take accountability for it.
Yeah, and then how can we educate marginalized communities and help them understand how AI is being used and deployed, and what's, what is it, what happening? Because I think people from all walks of life, they do their, normal routine, and I think that they are faced with algorithmic stuff all the time, and I think that they're unaware. I mean, I remember when I was working as a biologist in the health department, like just even the questions we ask, like the poor communities when they come in, and I felt so bad, because sometimes these communities, if they see just a question, they feel like they're obligated to ask, and knowing that it's public information because they're coming to a free clinic that then gets dumped somewhere. This is how it all starts, I feel, where people get categorized, and then for the rest of their life, like whatever they came into the clinic, it just follows them. Whereas, if they would know that, really they could maybe use a different name or maybe another address, whatever, and not have all this stuff in the system that just has followed them time after time after time after time. So this is where I think the education comes in terms of like letting people know what their rights are, what they have to share, what they really don't have to share, and all that stuff. Because this is exactly why, 25 years later, 30 years later, they walk into a bank, their life is perfect. And then this algorithm comes up and it's like, oh no, we're sorry, because we know that you've had major health problems in the past, that you couldn't pay this back 15 years ago before you got an education. But that education point, that change in that transformation point is nowhere in the database, by the way.
Yeah, maybe to add on this, Jewell, and also what Katie said earlier, I think I also don't think that everybody should know all the details about AI and in society. And obviously that would be great, and I think generally democratization strictly helps. But I think the first step is to make sure people just know where AI is already being used. Like that's the kind of most simple form of education. I think, I myself sometimes think about this question, like, what are products where machine learning are used? And like it's like dozens, right? Like it's everywhere. It's like in all social media. It's in like, basically whatever bigger corporation you interact with. And I think giving more transparency on this, just like saying, here's AI is used, here it's used. I think that would be a first step. And like, I don't know what would be a best way. I mean, one way would be regulation to, just have people say, a company say, look, like this is AI powered. Maybe also some campaigns, or even just like we're also, for example, setting up a showroom here on the AI campus where people also from outside can come and just see concrete applications, just to create this awareness. I think that's super important, and then that's the first step. And the other part is on the developer side. I mean, also as Katie said, it's like and Alexandra before, like it's the data, but it's also the algorithms, the objective function. It's like where it's used. Like it's a very complex topic. It's very different per use case. So I think the best you can do is, or like one thing you can do is just make sure that the people developing the software to have some understanding of ethics and kind of the more societal implications. And I must say myself, in my computer science degree, like I didn't have those courses, right? Like it was all like super technical, and like I think now it's probably gotten better in the last couple of years. But I think making sure that computer scientists are more trained on these questions during their studies, but also afterwards. And so one thing we're actually right now setting up is also together with the foundation, is to see if we can get a kind of AI ethics bootcamp that we offer on the campus that can basically all the developers can just attend. It's probably like a half-day workshop, so that they learn about these topics and all the complexities that come with it, because I think that's just the best way to improve here.
I'd actually like to challenge one thing that Rasmus said, but I completely agree that having more ethics also in computer science education would be beneficial to a certain degree. But one thing I would like to challenge is that having a benefit from just knowing where AI is used and deployed, because we're entering at times where this will be everywhere and ubiquitous. And just like, I don't know, with these additional information, okay, here's advertising, people are ignoring this. I think it's much more about how the AI is used, which impact it has on me, what rights I have to object, explainability, and so on and so forth. That really would be the added value of knowing that there is AI in place. And so I think that's an important step, to also have a discussion about explainability and understanding how these algorithms work and what to do against them. Back to what what Cathy said. She's the data scientist, so she probably has much more experience about bias and problems of artificial intelligence than I do on the technical level. I would like to challenge that, even though I think it's a very important question that always should be asked, on whom does this algorithm fail, that this is a question that can satisfyingly be answered by the person developing AI, because there's so many different cultures that will be affected by the algorithm. And I doubt that somebody can be an AI expert and an expert for so many different cultures at a time. So I think we really should think about ways how we could get this understanding, this way of thinking in an easily digestible manner to also the people that are developing this. And if this is an expert group that comes up with some, I don't know, 560 questions you should go through when developing your algorithm, or how else to approach this, I don't know. But I think it's really something that these persons can't answer themselves, because they just have their experiences and their horizon to come up with their perception.
To be clear, I wasn't saying that data scientists should be asking that. I said that people deploying algorithms, who absolutely must be held accountable, also must take upon the responsibility of figuring out for whom it fails. And the data scientists, as I said before, their only job should be translating the answers to those questions, those values questions, into code. They shouldn't be in charge of the ethics, although I think that every data scientist should be exposed to the ethical consequences of algorithms in general. So I do think ethics education in computer science is important.
Are you confident if it's only left to the businesses, in that case, deploying artificial intelligence, that they will come up with a satisfying list of people that this will fail? So I, for example, talked a lot with people or organizations that developed AI that explicitly told me they don't collect balanced data because it's just so much more expensive to collect additional data from underrepresented groups. Therefore, they don't go about it. The algorithm works well for the majority, then the profits are okay, and the rest is just a numbers game. And so,
yeah, well, that's exactly why, if we had enforcement of regulation and the enforcement included show me evidence that this works well for underrepresented groups, they'd have to buy that data, and it would be on them to prove that, supply that evidence before they'd be allowed to deploy their algorithm. So what they're basically saying to you is, it would be expensive to do it right, so we're going to do it wrong. And the whole point of regulation is, it's going to be more expensive to do it wrong.
Yeah,
That's right.
That's one of the things I do appreciate about the European data stuff, is like the actual fines look real, whereas the American way of finding Facebook like a slap on the wrist every time they do something horrible, it just means that they're like, great, now we know how much it costs. Yeah. We'll keep doing it.
Absolutely. Daniel, I know you were like, you're falling off your seat there. You had something to say.
Just to come back to the rule of thumb, I think that's everything that Cathy says. Basically, I really support, and all the stuff about the different ways in which bias can come in, and also how, bias is not the only problem. I think one good rule of thumb that, anyone thinking about developing, deploying an AI system should ask is, is an AI system a good idea to solve this problem? And I'll give you an example. I was at a workshop with a lot of people from, big tech companies about AI for social good. And, I decided to go there. I kind of knew what I was in for, and I was in for what I thought I was in for. And there was all this talk about using AI to solve, real social issues. And I just put the brakes at the start, and I said, could you include a first question, which is, does the social good need AI? And the response was, let's assume that's a yes. And the conversation continued. And that is not an obvious answer, because bringing in, a machine learning system into a problem is going to create a lot of other vulnerabilities. It's going to require data collection. It's going to require all this infrastructure. It adds in a lot of other aspects to a problem. And so solving something through bringing in an AI system is not always the best way to do it. And I think another important question to ask is, can you actually predict what you want to predict from this data? We're often, finding systems that have these very loose, spurious correlations being drawn between things that, they really shouldn't be trying to predict them. So I think it's very important to assess where, machine learning is not a good solution. We're bringing in a complex, IT system involving AI elements is actually going to make the problem worse or create more risks for people.
I really like this part because we usually say AI for good, but what means good? Where's the threshold? We usually think that technology will make our life easier, but yeah, maybe it could be for 90% of the population or even 99% of the population. So I will be curious from your side, where does this threshold between the part where technology is really useful, innovative, and where you are not willing to give a trade-off, where does that threshold stand for you personally? Would you like to start, Cathy?
Well, it's not a well-defined question. I mean, obviously it matters what the harm is and what the good is. So it's like philosophy 101 class, right? Like it's all about the context. That's why like in an algorithmic audit, I insist on a really well-defined use case before the audit. In particular, I don't think it's possible to audit a facial recognition software that you're going to license to other companies or police departments. I mean, whether it's used for good or evil really depends on how it's used. Really depends on the details of how it's used, and consequences. So it's just not a good question. I'm sorry to say.
And so speaking of this, so there was this regulation, I guess, the EU we just passed where 20% of the solutions are going to be audited. Is that correct? Is anyone?
If anyone else has read it, I mean, I can.
Yeah, 20% is going to be audited, but then how do they decide who they audit?
So yeah, I mean, it's. I think I have seen that number floating around somewhere, but basically what you have is you have a list of, which I've got open here, of 8 types of high-risk AI systems. And before any systems that fall under those categories are placed on the market in the European Union, they would have to go through an ex-ante conformity assessment. For 7 of the categories, that would be self-assessed. And for 1, which is remote biometric identification, which they're mainly talking about facial recognition, that would have to be done by a third party. Now, it's interesting because actually in the regulation, they explicitly kind of acknowledge that the self-assessment probably won't work, but they say there aren't enough auditors to do the third-party one, so we'll need to build up the capability to do that. But there's kind of this acknowledgement like, yeah, that's probably not going to work out. So we will need the third-party auditing eventually, and there's going, we're concerned about that because a lot of the very worrying systems fall under the self-assessment model, and yeah. I mean, they can be, if something goes wrong down the line, at least the documentation will be there for a regulator or an enforcement body to go and look and see. And, as civil society or as affected people, we'll be able to see some information about that conformity assessment in this publicly viewable database. So, I mean, it's better than what we've got now, but we would ideally want the third party for all of them.
I'll just jump in and mention that, like, I'm worried about third-party auditors as well as an industry, and I represent one of the only third-party auditing companies, but there's no reason to think that we're going to do a good job, especially because we have plenty of incentives, just like the Moody's, S&P, and Fitch did right before the financial crisis, to just sell stamps of approval to the highest bidder. And I've already felt pressure to do that. I mean, I've already lost out on RFPs because I refuse to narrow audits to some definition of fairness that I don't think is appropriate. So they want me to say this system is fair. And I'm like, but you're not even allowing me to ask the stakeholders what they think is fair. So I'm just saying, like, somebody else got that job, so really the question should be like, what are the requirements for open methodology and open results for auditing in general, whether it's self-auditing or third-party auditing? Because right now, if I had the leverage, and I really don't, I would insist that all of the work I do is open, the results, which does not expose the source code, by the way. would not expose the source code, but I'm not allowed to do it because my clients are like, why should we let you do that? Like, and moreover, my competitors are like, we'll do the audit without insisting on that. So like, it's a mess. It's a mess, and it's a particular mess because algorithms are inscrutable to outsiders, and algorithmic auditing is an inscrutable process to measure inscrutable things, at least right now. So it is potentially just a completely bullshit industry that I'm working on right now. So this is something that I hope you guys can address in Europe by insisting on really good standards for auditing, not just insisting on auditing.
Can we get you into the European Parliament soon to say exactly this?
Sure.
Please. Good.
And Cathy, make sure you say it's a hot mess.
It absolutely is.
It is a hot mess. So does anyone else have anything like pressing on your minds before we start to wrap up and ask you like the question of the 90 minutes?
So I would like to ask the question. It can be that a specific good AI is fair or certified as fair, but how can we then prevent that it is used for evil purpose?
I think it's back to what Katie said. I think it's not about certifying, regulating the AI. It's about the specific use case. It's always about the specific use case. I can do with the same, like, object detection algorithm, do something very good, but I can also do something very, very evil. So I think we should really move away from trying to regulate algorithms. We should rather go to regulating use cases. And whether the use case is done by a human or a machine, I mean, there's some difference, but ultimately it's similar. Both have biases, both can make mistakes, in both cases there is harm. And we just have to have these regulations per use case and do that really well. And then that way we would not basically get in the situation you just described.
Use case, you mean also new version of the same use case, things like this?
I mean, no, I think the use case is very, very specific. So for example, our case, one of our companies is in the breast cancer detection space. Radiologists miss every fourth breast cancer in their radiologist images. We use algorithms combined with human. The joint accuracy is much higher. There are certain requirements how precise this is, and based on that, we can then basically use this technology. Now, if you would use a different types of radiological images, even though it's a similar use case, we would need to do the same test again and again, see is this good enough or not good enough. So I think it has to be per application. Even if the algorithms are updated, the weights are updated, the training data is updated, it needs to get checked again. And that's even something you can automate, right? So if we add new data or change the algorithms, we run the same tests and see, does this new algorithm pass the test? And if yes, then it can be deployed. If not, then it can't be deployed.
I think one problem, since I come from the health space originally with all of this, is that if we look, for example, at marginalized groups, and they obviously have the same, cancer and all that stuff, but by the time it's detected, in these different groups, it's like too late. So what happens is you still already from the beginning, you have this interesting data set, which also itself isn't inclusive because for example, everything says, okay, when you get for colon cancer, you should get checked at 50 or whatever. I mean, I know I'm involved with the Colon Cancer Alliance still, within the last year, for example, about so many 35-year-olds, for example, that ended up having it. And then by the time they found out, it's stage 3, stage 4. So I think at the end of the day, if I'm kind of listening to what we're all saying, I mean, we have the regulators, we have the scientists. I mean, I agree what Cathy said, so you need these folks, every person from every walk of life, whatever, you need the data scientists that help kind of with the translation. But this goes back to having it from the very beginning, everybody or different types of people, stakeholders at the table. in order for things to change. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I feel like even now, like even me, I'm in like always a room, but it's always the people that already know supposedly what to do and how to do it, you know? And so I think that things aren't going to change until we have like different expertises or lack thereof at the table, so we can have these types of conversations, and we can have the data scientists translate the different conversations, the different mindsets, the different angles, the different perspectives, what's harmful, what's not. I mean, because I sit in rooms all the time, I work with colleagues all the time, like they do things all the time, and they work with themselves so much that they don't even know that what they do is harmful. Whereas me, I'm on the other side, and all my life, you know, like I do have that inclusion. So I can kind of be in the middle and the balance, because my life has been disrupted to always be aware of what everybody may be thinking or may be feeling when I walk into a room, or if I look this way or that way, and how maybe, you know, versus, so I kind of know like what I need to do in order to make them feel comfortable, in order to diffuse like maybe this barrier that's there. But I feel like the issue is that it's rarely reversed, you know, where people are saying, well, how would Jewell feel if we did this, because she's a scientist and I'm not, or whatever? How would she feel if I said this, or if I assume that she should do this versus me do this because I don't want to do that, you know, stuff like that. So I think it really does start with making sure that there is this conversation. And I feel like there potentially should be like a platform or something where people like can either ask questions, and all these questions can go into a database, which also should be built into algorithms and things like that, because that's just how I feel. I think I've heard that's what some of you all feel coming from your different perspectives, but we have to have everybody at the table. And so with that being said, I just said that, I went on a soapbox, I apologize, but it's just irritating to me. You know, I've lived in the US, put up with that stuff or crap for years. I'm in the EU, it's a different issue, but there's just an issue. And the issue is that people who are making decisions feel that their decision, is the right decision.
I completely feel you, Jewell. And Europe might be a bit better, but in that sense, it's not necessarily much better. If we think top down, as I said, then we will have these issues. And we think in terms of the rule of thumbs, one-dimensional thinking, we will not converge to a sustainable solution. That's why I said, think in this, you have to think about people and perspectives, the purpose and plan, the objectives. You have to think about the data, the past and present, the process and procedures. And sustainable changes will only happen in this multidimensional space. If you make steps along all these dimensions, we can focus on that dimension because it's a quick fix, but then we will have issues in another dimension. So it requires an effort. It's not just about people and perspectives. It's many things, and the challenge is that we have to have these dimensions, and there might be more dimensions, good in picture and move in this space rather than one-dimensional steps along those dimensions.
So we gave a lot of alternative. We gave a lot of insight to the audience. But if there's one thing that the audience should remember, what would be your call to action to your audience today?
Daniel, let's start with you.
You want a call to action, sign the petition I just put in the chat to call for a ban on biometric mass surveillance in the EU. But I think on a more general level, you know, just to recognize that not all technological progress is equal to or compatible with social progress, and you know that we have the power to be nuanced about that. We have the agency to decide what things we accept, what things we don't, and that, you know, if just to quote Deborah Raji from a great piece she had on MIT Tech Review earlier in the year, if AI doesn't work for everyone, it doesn't work. So we really need to ensure and do everything to make sure that that's the case.
Perhaps I can continue on that note. I always say AI for all cannot be without AI by all. And that means educate yourself, skill yourself, and contribute to the making the application, the monitoring, the assessment of AI.
Peter?
Well, first, let me say that I've learned a lot, and it's been really great to hear you all and to share your experiences and ideas. I think it does reinforce the need that I need to learn more, and also that I think that the general wider human rights community needs to look at this issue with a much greater focus and attention. And it's really great to hear the work that Daniel's doing, and others indeed. But this human rights dimension really is seriously deficient at the moment, and I will certainly be going to speak with other human rights defenders here in the UK to ask about what they're doing and what they're examining on this issue, and the importance of recognizing data as the new frontier of human rights.
Rasmus.
I think it's super important to just talk to the other stakeholders and who might have a different perspective on the same AI application, and do that as much as possible.
Alexandra?
I would also say really educating yourself more about the topic, and also not fearing about bringing up your voice and not buying from organizations that have biased algorithms. And I think if a big group of people gets loud enough about this, and we hopefully soon have similar like GDPR fines to really force organizations to make this right, this will probably motivate some of the more economically oriented organizations to tackle this with more heart and more power behind it.
Cathy, what's your call to action? You were all over that film. I really liked your viewpoint. I liked, I guess, like kind of just both sides. You can see both sides of the coin. I'm really curious, what's your call to action for everybody as well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have already said really good calls to action. I would say that what we really need is accountable algorithms. We need people who profit from algorithms to be held accountable, which is actually in the film I called for an FDA for algorithms. So like the burden for the people who want to deploy high stakes algorithms to prove they're both safe and effective, just like the drug companies have to, I think would be a good start.
Yudan, you have something to say on this?
I would say talk about it. Whether you are an expert or not an expert, just talk about it. Because when you talk about it, you will try it. And when you will try it, you will see if it's working or not working. And you will raise your voice, as Alexandra said. And we will be many more to raise a voice.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We would like to thank all the panelists for joining us today from all your corners of the world. It's been absolutely fabulous. The film was great. It was an eye awakener for a lot of us, I think. I think me being American and being in Europe, I know sometimes people say to me, oh, that's not our issue here. That's only an American issue. And we've seen recently that it's not just an American issue. And as more products and services are being built, I'm glad that you guys are doing what you're doing on a policy level, on a community level, on an educational level, activist level. I think that that's what it takes, like even having all those different types at a table, as well as the citizens to kind of help deploy some of these things. And I also would like to thank all of our partners, which have allowed the screening and also this panel discussion to take place today. Thank you all very much for joining. And until we meet again, we have lots of questions. Actually, we'll probably send you via email from the audience. And so maybe we can get those answered and post those somewhere within the next month or something like that. So thank you again for your time, everyone, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.